Good evening, everyone. Good evening, those who are coming. Today, our guest is Dr. Yakoob Ahmed. He is a scholar and an academician at the Islamic University, Faculty of Theology, and he is teaching Ottoman history there. Welcome, Yakoob Hocam.
Thank you very much.
How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm also doing quite well.
Good.
Today we are going to speak about the Ottoman ulama.
In English.
In English, exactly, in English. But we will keep it easy as possible.
Tamam.
And I want to start with my first question, which is focusing on the general term of ulama. What does it mean to belong to the ulama? And what are the ulama in general?
You know, it's a good question because a lot of the times when I come to Muslim countries, especially Turkey, there is an assumption that people know what the ulama are. But in reality, because we don't have this visible ulama in Turkey, you'd be surprised how many people actually don't know what the ulama are in general. And so what happens is they have a perception of this idea in that sense. Simply put, the ulama from the inception of Islam, which means from the beginning of Islam, were people who were trained and educated in the learning of the Quran and Sunnah in a particular systemized way, which was then later institutionalized. So it's generally an alim, and this is why we an alim, the individual who studies ilm. The word comes from ilm, not deen, which is important here, because what this indicates then is that while they are practitioners and students of deen, but the emphasis is on ilm, knowledge. What that indicates is these are scholars. Fundamentally, what the ulama are scholars of Islam who are Muslim from the Muslim tradition, which is an important understanding because a lot of the times when people think of ulama, they negate the idea that these are scholars and they assume it's the imam at the jami, it's the person who does the nikah, it's the crazy mullah in some South Asian country, that they see on television. And what they forget is alim fundamentally means the one who is studying ilm. And ilm specifically comes from the notion of studying Quran, Sunnah, and then the extension of that. So over time, the curricula, which was fundamentally first Quran and Sunnah, it extends and we have a more broader curriculum. For example, the learning of the Arabic language, the learning of grammar, the learning of rhetoric, the learning of mathematics, logic, kalam, and so forth. These are extensions that come from the Quranic and Sunnah tradition in that sense, right? And then as the Muslim world expanded, or the influence of Islam expanded, the curricula would include other languages like Persian, Ottoman Turkish, Urdu, Jawi, Malay, Bangla, whatever it may be in whatever different given country. So simply put, the alim is the person who actually is the student and the practitioner of the Quran and Sunnah. Now, why this is important is because Islam is not, it's a lived tradition, right? It's something we live. And so we need scholars continually to study Islam because the tradition is vibrant, it exists. And so Islam is a worldview of not just this life, but the next life. And so these are, in that sense, practitioners of that. And what's important is that in the Islamic tradition, then the ulama are considered as guardians of the faith, right? Or the sort of like continuers of the prophets in that sense. And what are they continuing? Which is the prophetic message, which is the idea of Islam in that sense. So that's fundamentally who the ulama are. Now, what's interesting is we use the word ulama in the plural sense, even though for the individual is alim. So we recognize that this is a particular group, an institutionalized group, similar to the way that we would usually use scientists say or academics say. So what this indicates is that this is then a dynamic and robust group. It's not just a group of people that have one idea. The basis is Islam. The idea is to learn ilm that is Islamic. that is reflective of this life and for the next life, and these can be a host of people in that sense.
To have like a question before going in the area of the Ottoman Empire. So why do you think today when we speak of ulama, as you said, the fundament is Islamic? That's right. And you said that it's not only what we know or what we call it is Islamic knowledge, like
Mhm.
fiqh, Sunnah, Hadith, and so on and so forth. So why do you think that the differentiation is today made when we speak about the ulama, that only we understand people who seek knowledge which are directly related to the jurisprudence of Islam or the Aqidah of Islam, but not
Sure.
their natural sciences?
So the distinction mainly comes because of the 19th century and the introduction of new forms of knowledge like technocratic knowledge, bureaucratic knowledge, subjects like engineering, new forms of science, and so forth, which initially were being taught in the madrasa system. But because the madrasa system in of itself had become so complicated, so to be an alim in of itself became such a what you could call complex field in of itself with so many multiple subjects and so forth, it would have been unfair to assume that the madrasa system could have then accommodated the new forms of knowledge. And so then a distinction was made between the forms of knowledge that were purely restricted to matters to do with religion and forms of knowledge that were what you would call more worldly matters like science, tech, and so forth. And then there was crossovers like mathematics were on both sides, and things like that. So the 19th century becomes the century of specialization because of the Industrial Revolution and the changing in the world and so forth, the need. But what we see, what's interesting though, is that because the ulama are still, like for example, I'm a scholar, right? I'm not an alim, but I'm a scholar. But it doesn't mean that I'm devoid of understanding how the world works. So you probably know that I have done journalistic activity. I've done other sorts of jobs. So while the foundation of ilm is helping me to place myself and talk about Islam and live as a good Muslim, at the same time, the other forms of knowledge I've learned, independent from the traditional learning, has allowed me to bring these two together. So there is an assumption and an incorrect assumption that most of the ulama didn't understand new forms of learning. But by the 19th century, because of the sophistication of the learning of ilm, and the complexity of the new form of knowledge, which was specialized learning, which was more positivist learning, then there was an attempt made to separate these as a way of making it easier. But what they did in the 19th century is they made the concession that even students who are studying outside of the madrasa system, there would be a basic Islamic curricula in that system of which the ulama will still be a part of. And even the students in the madrasa system would study some basics crossover, so like a multidisciplinary approach, that they would have basic understandings on that side. So this is off topic, but for example, a lot of people forget that Mehmed Akif was a vet, right? He was a veterinary, qualified as a veterinary practitioner because of farming backgrounds and so forth. But at the same time, Mehmed Akif was an alim who was given Jummah khutbahs at Hagia Sophia. So he's a unique case in that sense, and people forget because they often remember Akif as wearing the fez and writing poems, but actually he's unique, but he's one of the few.
Yeah, you already mentioned a good example of an Ottoman alim, and it makes us also easy to ask the next question, like who are the Ottoman ulama? What made them unique? Considering that it's a long period, um, you can also focus on different periods of the Ottoman time, and mainly on the late Ottoman time. We will continue with that part.
Yeah, I mean, so the Ottoman ulama, I mean, it's a difficult question because first we have to qualify what does it mean to be Ottoman in that sense. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the studies that look on the Ottoman ulama are usually affiliated with the Ottoman center of power. So wherever the sultans are moving, that's where the ulama are categorized within their direct sphere of influence. So the early Ottoman ulama, when we look at them, we're mainly looking at the ulama who were under the direct jurisdiction, which means the direct authority or influence at least over, so for example, Orhan Ghazi and then Murad Hudavandigar and then later Fatih, and Fatih's conquering of Istanbul becomes, or Constantinople, which becomes Istanbul, creates something very sophisticated. What's interesting is the ulama in general, they go beyond any space or place. So we have ulama in like Anadolu, but we would have ulama in India. We can have ulama in the United Kingdom. In that sense, the interesting thing about the ulama is they transcend, which means they go beyond the borders of the direct forms of authority. And the other interesting thing about the ulama is that they have a tradition that goes before the Ottomans in that sense. So the Ottomans, in some degree, then via the ulama attached to an Islamic tradition that comes before them, and they are attached to an Islamic tradition that goes beyond the borders of the Ottoman Devlet. Now, by the 19th century, we're talking about late Ottoman ulama, what we see is that fundamentally most studies in Turkish are based on the ulama who are part of the ilmiya system, which is the bureaucratic institutionalized system of creating ulama for mainly Anadolu and Rumeli in the Balkans in that sense, right? And so what's unique about the Ottoman ulama, firstly, is that as there is a development of education and a development of the madrasa system, the Ottoman ulama become bureaucratic, which is unique. Prior to that, the ulama prior to that are not as bureaucratic as the ulama are in the Ottoman context. And then what we see is that what's unique about the Ottoman case is that we have ulama who are members of political authority and power. So they are active participants with the Janissaries and the House of Osmans and the Ayyan and whoever else, and the Ghazi leaders, the military men and whoever else are involved in the maintenance of the devlet. In that sense, they become a pillar of the devlet, which is unique in the Ottoman case. We don't see this sort of imposition, which means interaction with power in the past in Islamic societies, which is something which is very different. So the Ottoman ulama indicate a sort of like, what they indicate actually is that the ulama are part of the identity of the Ottoman devlet. And without it, this is one of the things which means that the Ottoman devlet doesn't exist. Now, what's interesting about the Ottoman case is we have three, I'm giving you loose examples, but we can have three possible examples of who we could call an alim from the Ottoman Empire. We can have somebody who comes from the centralized bureaucratic ilmiya system, okay, which is established in the Ottoman domains by Ottoman power and is a bureaucratized system in which an alim is formed and they work in some shape or form within the Ottoman devlet, right? Then we can have an alim that becomes an alim in the Arab provinces. And the ilmiya structure doesn't reach out to the Arab provinces. So the Arab provinces have some level of autonomy in terms of the ulama they created. A lot of the good ulama in the Arab provinces would study in Azhar in Egypt, right? And then they would become judges, scholars, and so forth. And then you have exceptional cases where certain people just studied in ulama families. So Sayyid Nursi is an example of this, in the sense that you in Mesopotamia, you'd have areas where ulama, people were studying ulum ad-din simply based by living with people and learning of people, because the institution in some way is the Hoja. The Hoja is still the institution in that sense. But what the Ottomans successfully did is they institutionalized a particular system. So we had these multiple systems of what it means to be an alim in the Ottoman context. But what a lot of Turkish academics have focused on is the ilmiya itself. So when we use the word ulama in Ottoman history regarding Turkish, what we're actually talking about is the ilmiya. We're not talking about all the ulama in, let's just say, Baghdad or Cairo or Damascus or so forth. We're basically looking at, and fundamentally what we're looking at is Istanbul more and more, and parts of Anadolu in that sense.
So my question would be, adding to this one, had the ilmiya certain privileges? You mentioned for instance, that to be a judge, you had to have the education for it, which also
Yeah.
means that you're becoming part of the ulama.
Mhm.
Had they also further political privileges so they can influence, or how have they influenced Istanbul, especially those who belong to the Yemeni?
Yeah, the interesting thing about this question is I don't think Muslims in general have appreciated how the conquest of Constantinople is a humongous shift in the Muslim mentality. And Muslims never in the past, prior to the conquest of Istanbul, have ever conquered a monumental Christian empire in this way. So once Istanbul becomes part of the Ottoman domains, there's a interesting shift in regards to the ulama's role in regards to political power. Not only that, the emergence of the Janissaries, which is very unique in the Ottoman context. The Janissaries are uniquely Ottoman in the way that they are constructed, and the ulama's relationship regarding the Janissaries also facilitates a unique relationship in them being close to power. So the Sheikh al-Islam, we talk about Sheikh al-Islams in the Seljuk period and sometimes in the Abbasids. But what the Sheikh al-Islam means in the Seljuk period is something totally different than the Sheikh al-Islam in the Ottomans. The Ottomans have to some degree institutionalized a state mufti. Like, for example, in the Ottoman case, the Hal Fatwa, which is the fatwa to remove the Sultan, is a very unique Ottoman construct, which is that the Sheikh al-Islam writes a fatwa to say that this Sultan can be removed from authority and replaced by somebody else in that sense. So what you see is that I think the dynamics of how palace culture and the emergence of the Janissaries and Istanbul as a center and maintaining authority in Istanbul then creates a particular reality which facilitates for the ulama to be close to power because it needs to regulate the various forms of power. And what I mean by that is that, you see Ottoman texts in the past of the questioning of the level of piety and Islam in the Janissaries and in the House of Osman itself. So now you have an institution that needs to regulate that, but prior to that, in the Arab provinces, during the Abbasids or so forth, it was a very different dynamic in that sense. So it seems like the ulama then became like mediators between power and society, the various forms of power, and then all of these regarding Islam. So that became important in that sense. And I think this is what gave them that political agency.
Okay, I see. There's an echo problem someone has written. If you want, if I ask a question, I can mute your jam and then I will unmute you again. Okay. So the next question will be, who have been the most influential scholars in late Ottoman era? So you mentioned the mechanisms, the dynamics, also the systematic relations between the political elite, the administration, and the scholars. So like not only like who have been the most influential, but also why they have been influential.
So once again, it goes back to my point regarding who we consider part of the Ottoman ulama. So in the 19th century, we see like Ibn Abidin, for example, the great Hanafi jurist from Damascus, very influential regarding fiqh in the Hanafi discourse. Not only is he influential regarding fiqh in Syria, what we call Bilad al-Sham, but also Istanbul. And his son is part of the drafting committee for the Majelle and the first Ottoman constitution. Not only that, but he's very influential in other parts of the Muslim world. So here you can see someone like Ibn Abidin in terms of fiqh is exceptionally influential in that sense. And then you'll have obviously the regular names like Mustafa Sabri Effendi, Al-Malal Hamdi Azad, Musa Kazim Effendi, who come in the latter period during the late Hamidian period. You have Jamaluddin Effendi and so forth. It all comes down to what we mean by influence. If we're talking about influence regarding the creation of fiqh and hadith and Quran, then this is more systematic. But if we're talking about political influence and that sort of influence, or what we would call ideological influence, because Ismail Kara, he makes the argument that we start to see in the 19th century the emergence of what we could call Islamism, quote unquote, right? And this is where what you could call Islamic activism is starting to become prominent. And this is where many ulama become influential, in the sense that after the fall of the Ottomans, their activism and their works and their ideas regarding Islam in the political context continue, and they sort of influence the emergence of Muslim political movements. So in that sense, they were exceptionally influential. So a lot of people don't realize, for example, that when Mustafa Sabri goes to Egypt, he's not only he's influential in multiple movements and organizations that emerged in the 1950s, because many of those founders of those organizations were students in Egypt at the time. So we talk about, for example, Hassan al-Banna, but we forget that al-Banna was in direct conversation with Sabri in Egypt, for example, right? Now, the difficult thing is how can we prove Sabri's influence on Banna? It's hard, we can't in that sense. But what we can speculate is that some of the things that people like Banna was saying, or the Ikhwan was saying, or other movements that emerged from those regions was saying, was not that different than what Sabri had been saying prior. So there seems to be an intellectual continuation. The break is in, I would say, 50s, 60s, I would say 70s and 80s. There's a break between what you would call a late Ottoman 19th, 20th century Islamic political discourse, and then the sort of far more entrenched nation-state Islamic activity that takes place in the region. So the likes of Sabri I find very interesting, but there are many members of the ulama that we don't even know them, but I find them very fascinating, like the Qasemi brothers in Syria. Jamaluddin Qasim and his brother, for example, are exceptionally interesting, because what we see in this period is the emergence of what we call Salafism. And Salafism is a very unique 19th century phenomena. And there are many members of the ulama, like Rashid Radda, like Muhammad Abdul, who emerge as a result of that. What's unique is that when we see Mehmet Akif in his Sirat al-Mustaqim, he's actually publishing works by Muhammad Abdul. So it's intriguing in the sense that on the one hand, they're aware of the concerns they have regarding this new reformist Salafist movement, but at the same time, they're reading their works, and vice versa. The opposite is also happening. When you read works by, I was reading a book on the political thought of Muhammad Iqbal, and Iqbal had been reading Sayyid Halim Pasha. He was aware of Sayyid Halim Pasha's thought. So what's intriguing here is that it's not, I would say it's not which ulama are influential. I think in the 19th century in Istanbul, more specifically, there is a corpus of multiple intellectuals who are ulama and non-ulama, who are thinking from a particular vision of Islam, which leave an imprint in many parts of the Muslim world. But because of the collapse of the Ottomans, Istanbul becomes invisible to our consciousness. And we forget that at one point, Istanbul was the center of the Muslim world, right? And we forget that. So there are many ulama I could mention, but what I've noticed in the 19th century, the late period in particular, it's not any particular given individual. It's actually you can see there is a particular culture, which is interesting for me. And the reason why I mention this is because as historians, we can be lazy. We can often only write about the ulama who had written something, because we only get access. Power has the ability to write, and certain ulama wrote things, and so we have access to their works. So we assume that these are the most influential people. But in Islam, and this is one of the things that I keep promoting, is that in Islam, and we see this in the Ottoman period, which is different from the Western tradition, both oral tradition, which is the spoken tradition, and written tradition were being developed side by side. In the Western context, oral tradition is sometimes bypassed for the importance of written tradition. This doesn't happen in the Islamic sense. The reason why this becomes important is because literacy then is not that important in Muslim societies in terms of reading and writing. What's important is the ability for people to comprehend ideas. It was a society that listened a lot. The reason why that's important is because there would have been many ulama who would have given Jummah khutbahs on Fridays who would have been very influential, but because nothing was written, we really don't know what their influence was on society at the time, because we are dependent on these written sources. This is where people like Akif and Sabri and Al-Malal Hamdiyazar become significant, because they wrote and we have access to their ideas. But from time to time, when I read their works, they mention their Hodjas. They mention like people that they met, which are interesting, because what's also fascinating for me, there's many religious scholars who wanted to be invisible. They didn't want to be visible. They were happy, just like, look, I don't want to be famous. I want to be in the background, and so forth. So for me, what I find more fascinating is, rather than looking at the individuals themselves, is how the Ottoman ilmiya structure and the ulama sort of like world was collectively, as a paradigm, as a framework, facilitated a particular thinking of Islam, which is far more interesting in that sense.
I think this is also very interesting what you mentioned, that today the established narratives, it says that Islamism, or the thought of Islamic activism, started in the 1920s or 1930s with Hassan al-Banna, or back then India with Maududi. So this brings us also to the question, which is the next question. Like which role or I can also read it. Can you explain us the role the Ottoman ulama played in the modernization of the Ottoman state? Because the modernization part is often related to a part of westernization and secularization, and in that sense, it is quite essential which role the ulama in that part played.
So this is an interesting question, and a lot of people are finding it challenging to answer that, because we have a very Eurocentric internalization of the notion of modernity. And one of the reasons why that's happened is because I've said before that Ottoman history has become a sort of like a Western enterprise. So if you go to Pakistan, or you go to Mauritania or Morocco, or you go to Egypt, the universities or the madrasas or the seminaries, they're not going to teach Ottoman history. Generally, the curricula is life of the Prophet Rasul Sallam, Khulafa Rashidun, Umayyad, Abbasid. That's it, end. Right? So, but what we see in Western universities is there is an enterprise of the teaching of Ottoman studies, which is interesting. The best universities in the United States of America all have Ottoman studies departments, and they're large, robust Ottoman studies departments. The question is why? Why is there such an interest? Now, I don't have a problem with it, but the point I'm making then is that when we talk of modernity within the Ottoman context, there is a lot of baggage regarding Orientalism and Eurocentrism, in which we look at modernity purely from the sort of like a European or Western gaze. Okay, the problem with that is that we should ask the question, and some historians are asking the question: is there such thing as Ottoman modernity, a unique Ottoman experience of Ottoman modernity, which is the Ottomans' ability to negotiate and see what they want and what they don't want, what they can have, what they can't have. And these processes take time, because sometimes you take something in, and then you think there's no problem with this, and then 5 years later you realize, okay, this is problematic. And the Ottomans were going through this sort of process in the 19th and 20th century. So, I was reading the works by Armando Salvatore, who's making the argument that is it possible to ask the question of a not Islam and modernity, but Islamic modernity, meaning not modernity in the sense of modernism, but that Islam in of itself has the capacity to modernize societies in the image of Islam, if you know what I'm saying. So it can be different from Europe in that sense. Is that a question worth asking? And it's an interesting question for me, in the sense that can we make people improve and reform and change under the framework of Islam? I think what the Ottoman ulama are doing, by and large, is they recognize that the world is changing because of the Industrial Revolution, from capitalism, and so forth. And so the Ottoman Devlet has become more centralized, more bureaucratic, more technocratic. And so they're thinking, how can we, on the one hand, negotiate this with Islam, and on the other hand, try to find a way of negotiating the Reformation in a way that's accustomed to the world around us. in many ways, when we look at the Ottoman modernization effort, yes, there are many aspects that replicate and look very European, but in many ways, the Ottomans still were resisting European encroachment. And they were the only Muslim state. They were the only Muslim empire in Europe. They were European, okay? And at the same time, they were the only Muslim state that were independent from colonialism. And so it took World War One to destroy them. So what's interesting is if you look at Japan, you have the Meiji dynasty, the Japanese empire, and it becomes a Japanese nation state. Great Britain, the British Empire, becomes a British nation state, right? You see China becomes, but the Ottomans don't become a nation state. The Ottomans are destroyed. So you can see that while there is a form of modernity which is replicating certain European forms, and that's normal, there are many modes of resistance. And I think this is where I feel like some Ottoman historians have missed the point, because they've become so obsessed with the failure of the Ottomans, that they look into the mistakes that the Ottomans made and say, look, this will replicate in the Europeans, but they don't see the forms of resistance. They don't see the forms of rejection. They don't see the forms which are indigenous in that sense. And that's because my personal opinion is a lot of the writing of Ottoman history is not a reflection of the past. It's a reflection of how we feel today, in that sense. And as Muslims, we're in a tight squeeze. And so we want to go back into the past and say they failed us. It was because of them we're in this situation. But so I give an example. People keep asking me the question of Ottoman decline. And I really am not interested in that question. The question that I find more interesting is, how did the Ottomans survive for 600 years? It's a more interesting question for me, you know. So it all comes down to, I feel like, yes, the Ottomans made many mistakes, don't get me wrong, in the modernization process. But what I'm saying is, as the world is shifting and moving, the Ottomans also are recognizing that they have to make these adjustments. And they've always made those adjustments. They made the adjustments in the past. I mean, people could argue that the early Ottomans were Byzantine. And then once the Ottomans conquer Istanbul, they become similar to the Christians. And all the mosques in Istanbul look like Hagia Sophia. Of course, they look like Hagia Sophia. I mean, this is one of the things people, when I take them to Yildiz Jami, they say, oh, Hojam, this looks like a church. Yeah, of course it looks like a church. Go to Suleymaniye, it's Hagia Sophia. And that's the model. What was Hagia Sophia? It was a church. But you forget that. The imagination forgets that, because they'll say, oh, Hojam, you know, Yildiz Jami was built by an Armenian. Say, like Fatih Jami was built by a Greek. But they forget that. So the point is that there's something in the imagination of the 19th century which is emphasizing on a failure. And it's an emphasis on modernity being European and Western centric. That comes from the Europeans. The Europeans have an imagination of what it means to be modern. And what it means to be modern is in a very European context. So, for example, English is perceived as a modern language. Arabic is not. Ottoman was not. But who makes this argument? This is why the Turkish alphabet, it's not a Turkish alphabet, it's a Latin alphabet, because that was perceived as being modern. But the Ottomans were not trying to turn their alphabet into Latin. They were saying, let's just increase more Arabcha harfler, like let's just put different, noktas here. We can keep this language in that sense. So what I'm saying is, yes, there are forms of Ottoman modernity that the ulama got involved in, like the Majelle, like the constitution, like the Nizamiya courts and so forth. But these are also interesting moments of resistance. This is why when the Turkish Republic is formed, if the Nizamiya courts are secular, why destroy them? Because they saw them as Islamic. They didn't see them as secular. Right? Were the Nizamiya courts different from the Sharia courts? Yes. Was this unique for the 19th century? Of course it was. And this is a conversation we should be having about, okay, how do we place ourselves in understanding this system? So in regards to modernity, I think that the intellectuals and ulama, we know the mistakes. I think that is well known in Turkish society. What I'm more interested in now is the forms of resistance within this framework of modernity. And is there possible that we can move away from the articulation, which means the vocalization of modernity, purely what we mean modernity is Western European modernity? And can we conceptualize and think of a modernity, because we don't have another word to explain this phenomena of reformation? Can we have one which is like Ottoman? And what does that look like? And I would say that that's one that was in constant struggle and negotiation in that context.
So an add-up question would be, which is quite hypothetical, that do you think the Ottomans had a chance to transform to a nation state, or do you think the political elite which came after the Ottomans um, prohibited or didn't allow the Ottomans to transform to a nation state?
Personally speaking, I don't think the Ottomans had any imagination of creating a nation state. The reason why I say that is because World War One changes something. What World War One does is it ends all empires, right? Okay, we have, so for example, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, we have the collapse of the Ottomans, we have the collapse of the Habsburgs, the Austrians, and then consequently from World War One, we have World War Two, so the collapse of the British Empire, the French Empire, and then the German Empire, the collapse of the Meiji Dynasty and the Chinese. So what we see is a total obliteration of empires between World One and Two. These are game changers for me. But if you see prior to that, there was no way in their imagination to create nation states, because they were very critical of the nation states that were emerging in the Balkans. They were saying that these nation state projects are alien to us. So you see the works of Mehmet Akif, and this is interesting. He promotes Ottomanism as an imperial, patriotic bond, but he critiques nationalism. He says nationalism is not from us. This is a poison. We have to be careful. Mustafa Sabri says the same. He says these ideas of nationalism, they're not something that come from our people in that sense. What's intriguing about the Ottomans, and I believe this, I was listening to Rifa Abu al-Hajj. He was saying, he's a Palestinian academic in the United States, he's very old, one of the senior Ottoman historians. He writes about the 17th, 18th century, and he was saying that all the nation states that came from the Ottoman project have not succeeded in replicating, meaning reproducing what Western European nation states look like, indicating that this whole region is not designed, or what he uses Turkey as an exception. He says Turkey is the exception, but he says by and large, you see the Balkans, even non-Muslim nation states like Greece, Serbia, so forth. So there have been tensions regarding the nation state model because it's not something which is natural to this environment in this part of the world. And he says he believes it's because of the Ottoman influence, because the Ottoman influence was far more fluid, it was far more empire-centered. And what I've spoken to many historians in the past, they said, for me, for example, capitalism would never have been imagined by the Ottomans. Islam just doesn't allow it. Islam doesn't allow that type of thinking for capitalism to emerge from Muslim societies. This would have to have been a European construct. So in many sense, the Ottoman Devlet had many forms of reservations and rejections towards these ideas of nation state, the ideas of capitalism, the ideas of creating fixed borders. They didn't even have fixated borders. They had frontier regions, which were quite fluid. Its empire is very complicated, So, and the empire has a lot of plurality, and you can see in the Turkish Republic, going back to the Ulema, the Turkish Republic actually is, and it decides to make choices of removing the Ulema from Turkey, which is the only nation state which did that. It decided to not have the Ulema as part of its political structure. And that was important because in the Ottoman context, you would then say that the Ulema were an integral part of what it meant to be the Ottoman Devlet, which is, I call them a meta-institution. A meta-institution is an institution that governs every other institution or overlooks every other institution. And the ulama's role was to make sure that they were, making sure that the military were practicing Islam, making sure that the government was abiding by Islam, and making sure that the ulama themselves were abiding by Islam, making sure that the ayans were practicing Islam, or the technocrats, or the governors, or the sadrazam. So this is interesting meta-institution in that sense. And what's different is that the Turkish Republic decided and made a choice to remove that meta-institution. It said we didn't want that. So the language reform, it affects the ulama directly. The closing of the madrasas affects the ulama directly. Closing of the Nizamiya courts, the Sharia courts, the removal of Arabic, the removal of the fez and the tekke, the closure of the zawiyas and tekke, and all these things. Every single thing you see in terms of creating a republic what it actually was doing was removing any remnant of the ulama's visibility in any aspect of the Turkish machinery, which the other Arab nation states didn't do. They left the ulama, but the ulama marginalized themselves. But that's because in Istanbul, the ulama, as we mentioned, were heavily part of this modernization process. So it sounds strange then to assume that the ulama facilitated a modernization which facilitated their own removal. How does that, how do you conceive that? How could they not see that they were creating something for them to be so aggressively removed out of the system? So I don't think that's the direction they were going in. So it makes the case then that if World War I hadn't happened, we probably still would have had the notion of empire in the region, in that sense. And even after World War I, there is a belief by some Muslims that the British and the French can't sustain the Arab provinces, but by then it's too late.
So my question then would be, do you think that losing this meta institution today, like we have now almost 100-year Turkish Republic, or we can say more than a 100-year Turkish Republic experience, and you're also someone who lives since almost a decade in Turkey, and you teach Ottoman history. So do you think this meta institution could be replaced by any other institution, like Diyanet was found directly after the caliphate was removed, or do you think this removal of the ilmiya created certain problems inside Turkish society we still have today?
As a Muslim who's traveled around the Muslim world, I think it's to the detriment of the society to lose an institution like that. And that's because for many people, they have now internalized the idea of these ulama who were backwards, who didn't have a brain in their head and so forth. And so they construct this idea that we don't want this. And to some degree, what I felt is that the basics of Islam can be lost in a given society, because the ulama don't just have a authority regarding power. They were educated in society, they were visible in society, and there was they were accessible. There's an accessibility to them. And so, because I give you an example, in my house I have like Islamic calligraphy in my house, right? And for me, it continuously reminds me of Allah's presence. So when I come in the house, I'm careful. I'm saying, okay, look, Allah's name is written here, and so forth. Now, that sort of visuality is necessary. In Istanbul, the mosques, for example, a particular form of visual reminder of Islam. The muazzin for the azan is a particular reminder. And even seeing people walking down the street who look Islamically dressed in any particular way, it creates a particular connection and a reminder. To totally remove that in all the institutions of the state apparatus, what it does is it takes a huge part of Islam's ethical and moral component in regulating state and society in this way, because you don't have the people who have a particular consciousness. Now, the ulama have been replaced by academics or the Diyanet and so forth, but it's still a very reduced role in comparison to what the ilmiya was in the Ottoman context. In the Ottoman context, the ilmiya was still fundamentally independent from the state machinery, whereas now you have the Diyanet, which is directly under the control of the state, and then you have academics who don't have the same moral or ethical compass that the ulama that is expected from the ulama. So there is an expectation that if you're an alim, you're religious, you're pious, you're kind, you're upright, you're honest. This is an expectation. Even if the alim doesn't do that, because the expectation is there, even society puts pressure on the alim that you either abide by these standards or we're not going to take you seriously. And this is expected from the ulama as a whole. Now, when you don't have an institution like that, we don't have those same expectations from, for example, academics like myself. That there's no expectation for me to uphold any of these principles, and there's no expectation for me to influence society with any of those principles. What people want to do is they want to just hear intellectual knowledge from me. So I feel that when, I remember I lived in Syria, so I was fortunate enough to see people like Sheikh Ramadan Bhuti and so forth. And there was a particular decorum, a particular mannerism, a particular sense of respect that came with that particular tradition. And I feel, this is my personal opinion once again, that we should celebrate tradition. We shouldn't be ashamed of it, in that sense. And in Britain, for example, where I was born and raised, they are very proud of their traditions. They talk about 500, 600, 700, 800-year-old traditions that they are proud of. In that sense, I feel like, in that sense, the ulama were part of a tradition in this region that we should find ways of celebrating. I know alims, they're good people, many, on the whole, and they've done wonderful things in terms of their influence on me, on making sure that I was upright, I was honest, I was good to my parents. That I'm not covered in tattoos. It sounds bizarre, but now when you walk down the streets of Istanbul, this is something that's totally shocked me, and it's because when you don't have that mechanism of that society, it's not a mechanism that you need someone to tell society. It's the mechanism that society doesn't have someone they respect in society that can tell them, if you know what I mean. And that concerns me. And I feel like that's an important part of Islamic civilization.
Yes, we have a question from Semih Sood. He's asking an interesting question. Can we find similarities between Western scholars of resistance against modernity and Ottomans? And is this have any meaning for today?
So we do have, even in the Western world, there's an assumption that modernity means the West, and that's incorrect. When we look at modernity in particular, so if we look at England, modernity is actually very London-based. It's the urbanized city centers which actually reflect modernity. It's London, it's Paris, it's Berlin, it's Istanbul, it's these big cities that are reflecting these changes of modernity. There are forms of resistance in Western societies regarding modernity. For example, there is an apprehension in Western society regarding things like, sounds crazy, clocks and industrialization and aggressive industrialization. But what you can see is that in Muslim societies, this apprehension is greater. So if we look at the thinkers of the Enlightenment, on the one hand, these are Enlightenment thinkers who are very intellectual, but on the other hand, they say very little about colonialism or slavery. There seems to be some level of tolerance towards this sort of behavior. They know, they're well aware of what's going on. And this is what we call the darker side of modernity, right? The darker side of modernity is this consumption culture, is this the use of slaves, the aggression, the aggressive violence, the forms of colonialism and so forth. So, for example, the Ottomans, they were neither colonized nor were they colonizers, which is very unique because Islam wouldn't allow that type of interaction. Yes, they expanded their borders and so forth. It's a different tradition, but that type of aggression from colonialism, it doesn't exist. When we see slavery in Islam, it's a very different culture. For example, you could be a slave and become Sadr-Azam. You can be a slave and become the head of the Janissaries. You can be a slave. The Padishah's mother would be a slave. So it's very interesting in the Ottoman context, for example, that slavery was an opportunity in a strange way of being able to make it to the top. And that's very different than the transatlantic slave trade, which was exceptionally brutal and violent and would never allow Black people any form of parity. So what I'm saying is, yes, there are forms of resistance of thinkers, but what I found interesting is because modernity has a component of colonialism, that resistance was often muted and very less in noise in terms of Western thinkers, but it was greater in noise in not only Muslim societies, but even non-Muslim, non-Western societies who were directly feeling the impact of modernity. And we see this in South America, we see this in Japan and China, who are critical of this, and India, of course, but that has a Muslim tradition. Now, in the more contemporary sense, we have a lot of decolonial writers now who are critiquing modernity, and these are thinkers from all over the academic spectrum. And this is what I find interesting. So in Western academia, there's now a space of post-colonial thought and decoloniality and critics of modernity that are writing more and more about the problems of modernity and the sort of like aggressive European modernity of what it means to be modern. And yet in Muslim societies, we haven't taken on board some of these criticisms, which is interesting because we have scholars in the past who do critique modernity in that sense. So, yeah.
Okay, we are coming to the final question, which is which kind of education the late Ottoman scholars have received. And I will add to this one that you mentioned that we have today the case of post-colonial studies, decolonial studies. Do you think there's a possibility to connect the postmodern way of science with the critique which has been done to modernity and also the struggle to find an alternative way to still modernize, but also to be Islamic on the other hand? Do you think there's a possibility to link these both areas?
The honest answer to that question is I don't know. What I can say is that I mean I read more and more of these works, and I think there is a lot of merit in some of the criticisms. But I think where we differ is our implementation of possible solutions. I think our solutions should still be Quran Sunnah based. I think the difference between when you read works of look, so I give an example. There's a difference in the way that we see the Islamic tradition of learning. So the Quran, when it came to Rasul Sallam, it was sent to Rasul Sallam via a messenger, which was Jibreel alayhi salam, right? So Rasul Sallam is taught Quran. So one of the key components of Quran, which sort of like puts in motion the pedagogy of Islamic learning, is that when we write knowledge in Islam, books are written to be taught. In the Western tradition, books now, because of print capitalism, are written to be read. It's very different. So, for example, I would often in the class teach works of Islamic studies to my students. What is this paragraph? What does the author mean? What about this section? Falan, falan. And that's how books are written, right? And the reason why that becomes important is because there is a particular interaction between the Hoja, the student, the text, and then the history of the text. And we sort of interact in our culture in that sense. What is also important then is that we then are shaping the people from this Islamic culture, which is important. In the Western context, you can see that the way the text is written is that the book is sufficient for you. Now, the reason why I'm making this analogy, because one of the things that I've noticed more and more in Western culture, whether it's post-colonial or decolonial studies, is the absence of this like sort of like emotive, humane aspect of human beings. Everything is, people always say to me when they want to learn Ottoman history, for example, Hojam, what books can we read? I say, go find a good Hoja and study with them. They say, oh, tell me some books that I can pick up. So what I'm saying is there's something in these studies which is still disconnected, whereas our tradition is very different. Our tradition still attaches us to Allah. Our tradition attaches us to the notion of Tawheed. Our tradition, so for example, the idea of what it means to be human, we have a very different understanding of what it means to be human. For us, the idea of being human means there's a Khalik and your Khalq. There's a creator and you're created. If you reject the idea that there's an Allah, you've rejected an aspect of your own humanity, right? And then you have a soul. If you reject the notion that there's no such thing as a soul, you've once again rejected your notion of what it means to be human. There's nafs, there's blah, blah, blah. Now, the point I'm making is what I've noticed in all of these works is the negation of Allah, the negation of the Akhirah, the negation that the Quran is the truth, the negation of the importance of Rasul Sallam, the importance of Islam as being like something that's come to help humanity. When you negate all of that, then you can have interesting ideas of criticism, but the solutions are totally different. And so for me, like while I have no problems whatsoever of Muslims engaging in that thought, fundamentally, for the Muslim, the importance is that they are in this dunya to please Allah and to be as good as they can for the akhirah. That is necessary for them to understand that the reason why we die is there's a purpose after this. If we cannot understand that, then we have a situation. And Allah doesn't exist in the learning of anything. So people sometimes ask me the question like, Hojam, it must be difficult studying in Western academia where you can't talk about Islam. I said, you can't talk about Islam in anything. If you wanted to be a medical doctor, if you were a medical doctor and you said Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the rest of the doctors will look at you and say, what the hell are you doing? You crazy? Like, so what I'm saying is Islam is taken out of every component of learning. The whole framework of learning in the West has become so secular that it doesn't give the Muslim a chance to emotionally be able to identify with this. And this for me is problematic. So while I say that these books are important and I read them, I have to stress that your own tradition is important. When I saw a girl with a headscarf with a tattoo on her fingers, and I said, "Can I ask you a question?" "Yes, why do you have tattoos?" And she goes, "It looks amazing, right?" I said, "Okay, but why did you get it done? Do you know the Islamic rulings on this?" She goes, "No." I said, "How come? Why do you not know? Why did it not cross your mind before doing this? That what does Allah think?" And it's because you're not Allah-centered. You recognize you're Muslim, but you're not Allah-centered, which is that every decision you make, you say, well, okay, well, what is Allah's thinking behind this? Because Allah wants the best for you. And that might sound strange for many people, but for me, this is why the tradition is important. It grounds us down to a particular form of humility that I think is necessary. Like when you keep trying to be pleased by people, it leads to either narcissism or it leads to a form of real agitation. But when you're trying to get the pleasure of Allah, it leads to humility. You've got your head down, you're moving. This is why the culture of that tradition is important. This is why I tell students, no problem, you want to learn whatever books you want to learn, but still meet good people who can remind you of Islam. That's why, once again, going back to the beginning, the ulema become important. The access to these type of people who have been trained in a particular pedagogy, which its sole purpose is to continuously remind you in this dunya that you're here temporarily, that you're not here forever, and that there are people who are specifically trained to do this. I think this is necessary in any society, especially Muslim societies. And when Muslim societies don't have that, then we are leaving it to society themselves, or we're leaving it to the politics to do it for us. And when that fails, or if that's unable to do it, then we're in trouble. Then it becomes tough. This is why this meta institution was so necessary. It's not just about books, bro. It's about, our tradition is different. It's about the human interaction. It's the physical meeting of peoples that becomes necessary.
It's not about learning Islam by books, but it's about learning Islam by people who live it. And not the only Islam, like the whole tradition.
Yeah, I agree. Like Rasul Sallam, they say he's the walking Quran. There's a reason for that. It didn't mean that he was walking around reciting Quran. It meant he embodied what it was. It meant that when people saw him, they could understand Islam better. Like I'll tell you an example. I have people say this to me in the West all the time. Non-Muslims in the West can say, he's a good Muslim, he's not a good Muslim. Even they have the awareness, they have an understanding of what a good Muslim is and what a bad Muslim is. So the indication is that what does it mean to be a good Muslim? Okay, fine, like somebody who does ABC, but there's a difference between that and having learned people in our communities, learned thinkers in our communities, people who can give us solutions, people who can listen to us, people who can give us solace, people who can give our heart warmth, people who can we can look up to and say, I want to look like that. So now when you see people are on their Instagrams, what do they want to look like? They want to look like what they see on their Instagrams. They replicate in those visual mediums of the Instagrams. Why? Because any form of Islamic culture's visuality is removed. You walk down the street, what is Islamic that you see in the street? Nothing apart from the jamis. So when people's physical presence, or the only physical presence is you go to Charshamba in Fateh, right? Or you go to Ayub Sultan in the but if that physical presence is missing, and this is why the visuality needs to exist in all forms in that sense, and this is important. I feel like, so it's to create that connection, that human connection in our tradition. It's important. It's like, let's sit together, let's eat together, let's sit together, let's pray together, let's fast together. These commonalities is necessary. And then the Islamic tradition is always people remind you of Islam. And so I feel like coming to Turkey after living in the Arab world and coming from a Pakistani background, that I feel that that's one thing that it was very visible for me, is absence in that sense.
Yes, these have been great and impacting final words. But thank you very much, Hajam, for your time. We also like finished almost an hour. Do you have any final words?
No, I mean, like I just if anybody sees me in the streets of Istanbul, just stop and say hello. And I can speak Turkçe, but I don't hani chatbot konuşuyorum. So, but still, just stop me, say hello. It'd be very nice. And because I'm a foreigner in the country, so it's always nice to meet people who can make you feel home. So that's the only thing I have to say.
So we will inshallah do the next live broadcasting in Turkish. Okay. Thank you very much for those who listened today. We wish you a wonderful evening. Take care and assalamu alaikum.
Bismillah.